Nikolai Gogol remains one of the most enigmatic and influential figures in literary history. In this video, we'll explore the life, works, and legacy of the man who redefined Russian literature, blending social critique, absurdity, and deep psychological insight into tales that continue to captivate readers today. Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol was born on March 31, 1809, in Sorochinsy, a small village in Ukraine. His upbringing was steeped in the rich folklore and traditions of the Ukrainian countryside, a world filled with laughter, tragedy, and superstition. These influences would later form the bedrock of his literary imagination. For Gogol, his Ukrainian roots were central to his identity, yet Gogol's later career saw him gravitate toward themes of Russian nationalism. This duality has led to debates about whether Gogol betrayed his Ukrainian heritage or viewed Russia and Ukraine as inseparable parts of a larger cultural tapestry. Gogol's father, Vasily Afanasievich Gogol-Yanovsky, was a writer of comedies, and his mother, Maria Gogol, was profoundly religious, a dichotomy that reflected in Gogol's own works, which oscillate between humor and spiritual torment. He was a man of contradictions, ambitious yet insecure, a satirist with a mystical bent, and a perfectionist who burned much of his work out of dissatisfaction. After moving to St. Petersburg in 1828, Gogol struggled to find his place. He briefly worked as a government clerk, a job that would later inspire his sharp critiques of bureaucracy in stories like The Overcoat, The Nose, and The Government Inspector. Gogol's early attempts at poetry and drama were met with failure, but in 1831 he found his footing with a collection of short stories titled Evenings on a Farm Near Dikanka. Evenings on a Farm Near Dikanka is a vibrant celebration of Ukrainian folklore, filled with witches, devils, and villagers caught in strange and often hilarious predicaments. In stories like The Night Before Christmas and May Night, or The Drowned Maiden, Gogol captured the mystical essence of rural life while weaving in elements of the grotesque. These stories established Gogol as a rising star in Russian literature, but they were just the beginning of his journey. In the 1830s and 1840s, Gogol turned his attention to the rapidly modernizing city of St. Petersburg. It was here that he wrote some of his most famous works, collectively known as the Petersburg Tales. These stories delve into the alienation, absurdity, and paranoia of urban life, blending biting satire with elements of the supernatural. The Overcoat tells the story of Akaky Akakievich, a lowly government clerk who becomes obsessed with saving enough money to buy a new overcoat. When the coat is stolen, his life spirals into despair. The story is both a poignant exploration of human dignity and a searing critique of societal indifference. Akaki's ghost serves as a haunting metaphor for the dehumanizing effects of bureaucracy. Fyodor Dostoevsky reflected on Gogol's influence on Russian literature, stating, "We all came out of Gogol's Overcoat." In The Nose, Gogol pushes absurdity to its limits. The story follows a government official who wakes up one morning to discover that his nose has disappeared and is now walking around the city, dressed as a higher-ranking officer. Gogol's creative process was famously erratic. He would often write in bursts of energy, followed by long periods of inactivity filled with self-doubt and anxiety. He was known to read his drafts aloud, testing their rhythm and emotional impact. Interestingly, he would sometimes laugh uncontrollably at his own jokes, to the bewilderment of those around him. Gogol's absurd humor underscores deeper themes of identity, social status, and the fragility of human existence. In The Government Inspector, Gogol unleashes his satirical genius on the corrupt bureaucracy of provincial Russia. The play centers on a case of mistaken identity, where a petty con man is mistaken for a government inspector, exposing the greed and incompetence of local officials. The play was a sensation, earning praise from Tsar Nicholas I himself. Yet its success also brought Gogol criticism from those who felt his satire hit too close to home. Gogol's magnum opus, Dead Souls, 1842, is a novel that defies easy categorization. Ostensibly a picaresque tale about a conman named Chichikov, who buys the names of deceased serfs to inflate his social status, the novel is also a profound meditation on human folly, greed, and the emptiness of material pursuits. The whole world is a mask. The faces of men hide other faces beneath them. Though Gogol planned Dead Souls as a trilogy, he burned much of the second part in a fit of despair, leaving the work unfinished. This act reflects Gogol's increasing religious fervor and self-doubt. After a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1848, Gogol became convinced that his writing had to serve a higher moral purpose. This conviction led to the creation of selected passages from correspondence with friends, a work filled with moral exhortations that alienated even his closest supporters. What's less well known is how his religious fervor may have been a psychological response to his own insecurities. Gogol struggled with intense guilt, believing that his satirical works mocked humanity in a way that distanced him from divine grace. His famous act of burning the manuscript of the second part of Dead Souls was not just an artistic decision, but a symbolic self-purging of his doubts and sins. Gogol's religious turmoil reveals a man torn between his calling as a satirist and his yearning for spiritual purity. His internal conflict reflects a broader tension in 19th century Russian culture between the secular and the sacred, making him a precursor to later existential dilemmas in Russian literature. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Gogol never married and seemed disinterested in romantic relationships. This has led to much speculation about his sexuality and emotional life. Some biographers suggest that Gogol's intense friendships with men, combined with his religious guilt, created a psychological block that prevented him from forming traditional romantic attachments. The absence of romantic love in Gogol's life is reflected in his works, where relationships are often depicted as dysfunctional or secondary to existential concerns. This detachment might have allowed him to focus more deeply on societal and metaphysical themes, but it also left him profoundly isolated. Gogol's works are marked by recurring themes: the absurdity of human existence, the tension between the individual and society, and the interplay of the grotesque and the sublime. His influences ranged from Ukrainian folklore to European romanticism, and his impact on literature is immeasurable. Fyodor Dostoevsky credited Gogol as the father of Russian realism, while Franz Kafka's surreal worlds owe much to Gogol's pioneering use of absurdity. Vladimir Nabokov hailed The Overcoat as the greatest Russian short story ever written. Gogol's life ended as mysteriously as his stories. In 1852, he died at the age of 42, possibly from self-starvation. His last days were consumed by spiritual torment, reflecting the same contradictions that defined his life and work. Nikolai Gogol's legacy is one of complexity and contradiction. He was a satirist who sought the divine, a realist who embraced the absurd, and a writer whose works transcend time and culture. As Gogol himself wrote, "The longer and more carefully we look at a funny story, the sadder it becomes.